All right. So welcome, Anna-Marie. Welcome to this interview. Thank you very much for accepting and for coming to this to talk to the topic about the ecological organization. My name is Marianne Bernasconi, and I am really interested in what could help us facilitate the transformation of our society towards regeneration and a more distributive world. So that's why I'm interviewing several people with several mindsets and perspective. And that's why I was really interested to have you, Anna-Marie, to discuss about what an ecological organization is. And just before we go right into this topic, I'd like to know how come you were interested into this topic, and when did it really start for you? At what point in your life? And yes, hold on a second. Okay, now you should be able to put your mic on.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Marianne. I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Thank you. I was a little bit getting a little bit stressed at the end there because I couldn't unmute. Can you share how was the invitation? Were you just welcoming me, or was there an invitation to share a little bit about myself?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I was wondering where this interest for ecological organization come from, and when did it start? At what point in your life did you decide to dig into these topics and decide to work on it?
Yeah, that's so fascinating because I'm not sure that I don't know that I ever made a decision to, and sometimes I'm not quite sure how I ended up here. But I guess the general overview is that about 7 years ago, I picked up Frederic Laloux's work on reinventing organizations, and it was like this light bulb went off in my heart. And it made me realize that firstly, I wasn't alone in feeling that the way that we are often in groups and especially in organizations can be very kind of inhumane. And certainly that was my experience. I felt like my soul was often dying. It really was a very, very visceral and strong experience. And it was at a time when I'd been employed in organizations that I thought would be my dream organization. So a very large charity in the UK, and then a very small not-for-profit. And while I was really excited about the work that they were doing, the how of the organization, my experience of being an organization member just felt really wrong to me. And so picking extraordinary moment for me in realizing that not only was I not the only one that craved something very, very different in our organizations, but there was all this work happening. And that basically just started off on this 7-year journey into distributed decision making, all the things that you spoke of as your interest right now. What does it mean to be regenerative? How can we do so in a way that makes us feel and like intricately involved in our communities? How do we access those aspects of ourselves that are like nature? And I think over those 7 years, what really kind of led me to this specific point with ecological organizations has been my personal relationship with nature and the natural world and how that's evolved over the last few years. Yeah, one more thing, I guess, to throw into that. So I've been intense health issues all of my adult life, so over 20 years. And the experience of that, which has been at times often a very understand for myself, what do I need? Where do I feel isolated and alone? Where do I feel most held and cared for? And finding that often a lot of that time was in nature, that it was within nature that I felt often, I guess, most myself, most part of the bigger world, part of the universal nature. And actually, this work in ecological organizations really came as a part of a process of my self-understanding of what I'd been through over the last 7 years and what was my perspective on organizations.
Thank you a lot for that. I think maybe there's some internet issues because it cuts at some point. So I don't know if you can switch, or we can still understand, but sometimes it's a bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I noticed that too. I don't. Let me. I don't have. It's normally okay. So I think we're just going to have to try.
It's okay. Let's go with this. And that's really interesting how you said several times that you were having all this feeling of resourcefulness in nature. So I'm wondering, and also you talked about inhumane organization. So I was wondering, what is the common point between nature and a humane organization?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, if we understand what humane means as being in its being compassionate, then I guess where I've come from with organization is, when I think of what to me is a humane organization, it's one that is compassionate of what it is to be human in the world today. So it's really understanding kind of the core elements of what it is to be human. And those are things that I think are often very connected to nature. So things like that we humans have internal seasonality. We have times when we are activated and energized. We have times when we need to retreat and be in rest and grief. We have times when we're harvesting. We have times when we're letting go of things. So that's one element, for example, that I think to me, a humane organization would recognize and therefore help to create the conditions to support us in that. Understanding that the more that we support people to be in touch with their full self, then the better it's going to be for the organization. So I'd say that's one example of the way that I would view how we can be humane as an organization with how we are as human beings in the natural world.
And also what I found really interesting reading your blog on Substack and reading your website, I could see that you also were talking about the cycles of an organization, because we see it probably as something very linear that is constantly expanding, but everything I guess on in this life is related to cycles. So is it what you call an ecological organization, an organization that is also living normal natural cycles, or what is it?
Yeah, I'd say that's one element. That's certainly the kind of lens that I would view an ecological organization through, would be that lens of seasonality. Yes, I have observed that, or it certainly feels to me a key element to understand their own seasonality, as you said, and the different cycles they go through, which can even be when might we dissolve, and when might be right for this organization to no longer be, and how can we do that in the most dignified way. So yes, I guess what I would so I would say yes, that's a very certainly a quality of an, as I would describe it, as an ecological organization. But I also would want people to hear that as a choice that I make, as the lens that I look through as an ecological organization, and that we can really look at it in whichever lens makes most sense to us. What I would say at the heart of how I have, as the term came to me, ecological organization, is really understanding that organizations are relationships, whether that's human relationships, system relationships, the structures that we build, that everything within an organization is a relationship and relational, and that everything outside of an organization is a relationship and relational as well, that there's no separation. So we might have the kind of constructed barriers between an organization and the rest of the world. And those might look like which members are a member of an organization and what's the kind of rights and expectations they have as member of an organization. Organization is actually separated from the ecosystems and the social systems that they're situated in. So to me, that would be the heart of what an ecological organization is that recognition of relationships. And from that, one of the lenses that we could choose to look through is, oh, what is relationships? Well, there's a seasonality to that as well.
So what do you mean by that exactly, the link between relationship and seasonality?
Yeah, I guess in the same way that we would look at how a natural ecosystem occurs, which is, again, it's full of relationships, it's a living system, it's full of living relationships. And so if we observe those ecosystems, there is inherent seasonality within those. So none of the relationships that take place within a living system take place outside of time. So if we were to look at say like old growth, for example, which is something that I personally like, a framework that I'm really drawn to, there's a real seasonality in the relationships that take place within that, which create the conditions to be so supportive of so many species.
And so you're talking about, so let's focus on the relationship inside the company, because before we go outside of the company, so I also saw that you were using tools or frameworks such as Sociocracy. So what is it exactly, and how does Sociocracy help an organization become more ecological?
Yeah, great. So I Sociocracy is a tool or a framework that people or an organization, say, can adopt. So, or a group, anyone that is working with other human beings. And it's a way to support how we govern. So it's a way to, it's a framework we can choose that supports us in making decisions together, in deciding how we make those decisions, in deciding who makes those decisions. And then it offers us ways to do that, that to me help us be more a humane organization. So at its core is the idea of consent decision making, as opposed to, say, something like more based or managerial decision making. And consent decision making at its heart holds a perspective that everyone's perspective is important, that the no voices are just as important as the yes voices, and aspects like that. So yeah, it's one of the tools that I chose to train in. There's other kind of governance tools that many organizations choose. There's Holacracy, if you've heard of Holacracy, which shares some similarities with Sociocracy. Or there's other organizations might decide they want to kind of design their own governance process, and they might pull in certain aspects that can be quite drawn from Sociocracy. But yeah, that's one of the tools that we as a group can utilize to support decision making in a way that moves us from a hierarchy based decision making into one that really looks to incorporate multiple voices.
And what I found really interesting with Sociocracy and Holacracy is that for me, it's tools that are really purpose-based. So I guess that's how it helps the company or the organization be more aware of natural cycles or seasonality, because then we have this purpose that, in my sense, is the real leader of the organization. So what is your thought about this? How does sociocracy, or those tools that gives empowerment to the people, how does it help us to have better organizations more focused on nature?
Well, that's really interesting, because I'm not sure that it automatically would lead to that. I'm not sure that that's the goal of a tool like Sociocracy. So I think you could adopt Sociocracy, and it doesn't, to me, mean that you'll end up placing attention or importance on seasonality specifically. But what I do, what I have seen, absolutely, like you've said, is that so Sociocracy, Holacracy in particular, in my experience, I have less experience of Holacracy, but I have some, is that Holacracy does place purpose at the center of decision making. And it will do that in numerous ways. So from centralizing the wider organizational purpose in decision making and strategy, right through to each role having a purpose, and that purpose then being a kind of sub-purpose of the larger purpose. But yeah, that's interesting. I'd be curious, if you found then in your experience that something like Holacracy kind of automatically brings in a seasonality?
It's just an intuition. I don't have I don't have concrete examples of organization with holacracy that are really connected, but the way I was trained in holacracy, and the way I was trained was really connected to sensing and really feeling what's coming up. So something, it connects to something more natural than just projecting and having this ever expanding organization that wants more profits. So it's more sensitive, intuitive. So that's a general feeling. Maybe it would be really interesting to know more about the connection between organization that adopted holacracy and their ecological aspects.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, that's wonderful that that was your experience in training. And I absolutely, I mirror that experience that many of the people I know I've spent time with that adopt sociocracy or holacracy. Certainly there's a much stronger sense of awareness of the importance of sensing, the importance of holding the organization as a living system, as something which in itself is pulled from nature. But yeah, partly why I'm smiling is it's really interesting, because I actually struggled with holacracy personally in the organization that I was in, and my experience has been quite different than yours, and that's really fascinating. I've actually found holacracy. I've found that actually there was a rigidity to it that to me pulled away from this more of the sensing and the sort of nature-based framework that I've noticed myself more pulled into recently. But I don't know if that's just because I have limited experience. Maybe there's something interesting to be noticed about the types of people that adopt practices like holacracy and sociocracy, and that might likely be more in touch with things like theory you, or where you're speaking of, which is this sensing, noticing, responding aspect of being in an organization.
And I guess that each organization, even though they say that they're holacracy based, we all have our own way of using the tool. That's
Absolutely.
I use it for several years in my organization,
Mm-hmm.
and actually we didn't use it exactly as the constitution says, so
Mm-hmm.
we can always adapt, because I agree with you, it can be really rigid.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I found really interesting into this type of the way we organize is that it looks like cells. It looks like, as you said, a living system.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said also before, everything is part of a system, an
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem. And how do you include the voices of stakeholders or other people, or maybe non-human entities
Mm-hmm.
inside the governance in your experience? How do you open the organization to more voices?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I have had huge experience of that, because I think it's very, very new. I've given a lot of thought to how we do that, and I've taken a lot of notice of recent organizations that have started to do that. And I find that absolutely fascinating and really, really exciting. For example, I've just recently that an organization called Faith in Nature, which has now created a board member that represents the natural world. So that board member, excuse me, and that board member has a voice and a vote, and it sits there on behalf of nature. Yeah, certainly from my perspective, I think bringing in more than human voices is vital, especially at the point that we're in with the world, but vital anyway. And I think there's numerous ways we can do that when it comes to governance. There's very simple things we can do, like we could create a role in our organization that represents nature or a specific more than human being. So it could be a local river or an area of land. And we can rotate people into that role, say for 6 months. So when they're in meetings, for example, their role could be to speak on behalf of that more than human being. And maybe their role could be to be funded to find out the closest, most up-to-date information about what that more than human being, that river or that piece of land is needing right now. There's other things that we could do, like we can adopt the advice process, which is a wonderful, simple tool we can use in any kind of decision making, which says that before we make substantial decisions that have an impact, that we seek the advice from those that are specialists in a particular area. So when it comes to more than human voices, one way we could do that is to take advice from those people that work closely. So if you want to bring in the voice of a local piece of land, then the way I would go about it is to seek out those that have the strongest relationship with that piece of land and that have worked with it and have that deeply personal relationship with it. And I would look to have advice from that person. So and then there's other things we could do, like we can have what I think of as wisdom councils. It's probably not my word. It's probably been around for a very, very long time and I'm adopting it, but wisdom councils. So we bring together councils that become involved in our decision making and support us in our decision making, again, from people that have a really, really strong relationship with that part of the natural world that we're looking to. So I'd say those are some like ways that we could start to explore. And then there's and they're really simple because they're less threatening in a way because they're not asking us to make any fundamental changes. You know, they're just asking us to start experimenting and to bring in those voices. And then and it's wonderful to aim at things like having ward members with an actual vote that represent the natural world, or somewhere like Patagonia, where the stakeholder becomes planet Earth.
And what I found really interesting into this topic is the aspect of stewardship. And actually in French, this word doesn't exist. It's really interesting.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
how could you define what is a stewardship-based organization?
Yeah, so to me, stewardship, and that's really curious. I wonder first, can I ask you, is there anything similar to that in French that you would like? Is there experience? Have you come up with what would be the closest term to
In
stewardship?
French, I think something like a guardian.
A guardian. Okay, well, I think that's probably very, very similar to how I would view
Mm-hmm.
stewardship. So, um, for me, stewardship is really, you were talking at the very beginning about shifting mindset, and stewardship is to me a deep shift that we can take in our mindset about the role that we have as humans. And some of those shifts can be to stop looking at organizations as these entities that we own and start looking at them as living systems that we steward. And I think the change, how I perceive, I to kind of put into a metaphor, is how I would imagine when you see really healthy parents, and instead of kind of seeing their children as these humans that they kind of want to determine their life outcome for. So I want my daughter to be a doctor, or I want my son to be a lawyer. And they see their role as being a very specific one, which is like, we will give our children as many of the tools that we can to support them in becoming the adult that they were meant to be, and we'll discover that with them. And that's the sense of stewardship that certainly makes my heart sing when we approach organizations, is from that sense of like, okay, this is not my organization to own, this isn't none of ours to own, but we get, for a very specific amount of time, to get to care for this organization and to ask questions like, what does this organization mean? What's best for this organization? And often stewardship asks a lot from us. It's not an easy place. Stewardship might say, or it might look like, I need to leave this organization because I'm not being helpful for this organization, or the disruption I'm bringing is more unhelpful than good. Or it might be, I need to leave this organization because I've realized that the direction my life is going in and the direction this organization is going in is not the same direction. It might also say, I need to stick with this organization, but it might be that like I move from having a job description where I own something to having a role-based description. And again, you bring that stewardship into the role. And for me, that's also like one of the really exciting changes that I really enjoyed, particularly in Holacracy, which is the idea that we steward roles. Roles aren't ours, they don't belong to us, that we don't identify, or we try and break the identification of like, I'm Anna-Marie, I'm the CEO, and we say, no, I'm Anna-Marie, and for a certain amount of time, I get to steward a CEO role. Probably wouldn't be a CEO role in a Holacracy organization, but as an example. So we get to say, maybe for like 2 years or 3 years, I get to steward this role. And what I think making that mind shift does is it helps bring to the surface and mitigate some of those really understandable human experiences, such as, I must fight to the death to stay in this role because that's how I earn my money, that's how I identify myself, whether that's right for the organization or not. Or I must stay in this organization because I don't know, I earn so much money every year and I've given my kind of life to this organization. I want to rule over it, and I want to be able to say, and it helps us to start noticing these things, which, I say, to me, really understandable experiences, but they're not very helpful often. So stewardship to me is all of those things. It's understanding that we as humans, we don't own anything. We get, but often if we're lucky or we're fortunate, we get called to steward something for a while.
That's beautiful, and I loved your metaphor as parent caring for children. So thank you very much for this very enlightening definition of stewardship. And it really relates to what you were saying at the beginning about compassion. It really needs for us to shift. And also it makes me think about shifting from ego system to ecosystem, and really stopping identifying us with a role, particular role, and really seeing organizations and our role in life as stewards and supporting other entities. And so my final question, since you've worked with many organizations, many different types of organizations, and also we don't have to explore all the tools you've been trained in, and there's a lot. Also there's the Doughnut Economics, that's how we met, because we're both practitioners in this topic. So we won't have time to discuss all the topics, but I was wondering, what advice could you give to an organization to help them become more ecological?
I guess I'd probably advise them to just have firstly to have a lot of conversations, to really dive into it, to ask themselves questions. And I would probably advise them to start with the questions first and forget so much about getting to the answers, but start to enjoy being in the questions and what it is the questions start to reveal. Why do we want to be an ecological organization? What is it that we're looking to change? What might that mean for us? And I think it's through conversation that really any organization is going to have the most interesting experience, because people will be having ideas and thoughts about it. I mean, one possibility, so when I was reflecting for myself how I felt about organizations, I kind of accidentally authored an ecological organization framework, which wasn't my intention, but that's kind of what landed on the page. So that might be a useful place to help ignite those conversations. Like, is just full of questions, really, and it's a lens that perhaps an organization could hold up and look through if it's struggling to sort of start to find its own way into the conversation. But yeah, I think fundamentally just to have the conversations, enjoy them, and discover for yourself what it means, and research. There is so much information that is available to us. It's one of the absolute wonders of this, the age that we're in. As overwhelming as it is, there is so much information out there about all the different tools and all the different ways that you can explore, and all the different ways that we can be together and make decisions together. And really, it's about finding, for every organization, its unique flavor, it's unique. So just jump into it, find some route into it, have the conversations, and then just start exploring, start practicing. You know, you can do it in very, very small ways. You can make small changes and they can have huge ripples. So just experiment, learn, enjoy.
Thank you very much. And I love how you link it to conversation. It seems simple, and at the same time having deep conversation and deep listening, sensing, and something that is probably not that easy, but starting with a simple conversation is always a good start.
Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned the framework that you design, and it's available on your website. So it's
That's right.
Anna-Marie-Swan.com. You
That's
also
right.
have this blog that is really interesting. So
Thank you.
if you want to, for people listening, if you want to dig into Anna-Marie's work, there's
Mhm.
a lot of content that that can inspire us to move towards more ecological actions and transition for our organizations. Thank you so much, Anna-Marie, and
Pleasure.
and let's help organization become more ecological. Thank you.
Great.